he was saying, places for people. We build places for people. And I just thought, what were we doing before? This is bizarre that we wouldn't be building homes, commercial property to suit the people using it. We're all super conscious about what we ingest, food and drink wise, but not about what we breathe in the same way. And again, we're quite well educated on nutrition, but not so well educated on air.
So to kick things off, can you tell us a bit about your background and how you found your way into commercial real estate and specifically air quality? Mm-hmm. And then also mix into that, I think it'd be great to just understand a bit more about your entrepreneurial journey as well, because obviously you've been a CEO of 2 companies now before 35, which is quite impressive. So it'd be great if you can take us back to start and how you got into it.
Nice. Big flex for me. So I was at university and I actually started studying petroleum geology and then had a complete crisis of conscience because environment. So then I pivoted into environmental science.
Complete opposite.
A complete opposite. And then I stayed on at university because I loved it so much and did a master's. And as part of my master's, I did a specialist subject project in indoor air quality because someone explained it as being a dark art, even in academia. Okay. And I thought that's bizarre because we spend so much time indoors, particularly in the UK. So I studied that and it was really interesting. And then to skip a few, I started entering the workforce, and that is so much more challenging than anyone prepares you for. So I was applying to lots of graduate programs and getting pushed back. I wasn't really sure they were for me anyway. And they were sort of in the field of tech, broadly speaking. It wasn't property technology, it was just tech. I got loads of rejections, that's fine. And then I joined a startup as just admin, so making teas, coffees, booking meeting rooms. The reason I joined it is because I didn't actually know what I wanted to do in a company. I didn't know whether I was operational. I didn't know if I wanted to go into marketing. So I joined and then kind of naturally found myself in a salesy position. But I understood that some of the technology that was being used in this prop tech startup was indoor air quality monitoring, which I thought was really interesting, having studied it. And that was also the bit that I kind of migrated towards selling because I understood it like the back of my hand. But from a internal perspective, I wanted to work a bit more with the tech team to say, how are you visualizing this data? Because did you know when CO2 levels are X, it impairs cognitive performance by this amount? Whereas it had been the case that they had been triggering things like when CO2 reaches X, send a notification to a building manager. And that was as far as it went. So there wasn't a huge amount of context behind it. So essentially that's the role I kind of first started in. Prop tech startup, sales / kind of technical sales, helped develop that particular product. And then as a result of working there for about 3.5, 4 years, there was then the opportunity to spin out and have that air quality solution be its own thing. And that was AirRated. So AirRated was established in 2018, and then 2019 was a whole year of research and development and getting the hypothesis going around it, but also testing the hypothesis on real world case studies. So does monitoring indoor air and then trying to certify it actually work in reality, and what do we need to take into consideration, i.e. external air quality and climate? So that was really interesting. And then I started as head of environmental science and then was promoted to CEO September 2020, which was a really interesting time.
An interesting time. But you were ahead of the game setting up AirRated before it became COVID.
Before it was COVID. And I mean, I have been asked before in interviews whether COVID was more of a blessing than it was a curse for indoor air quality. And I've thought about it a lot, and I do feel as though COVID set us back in the indoor air quality space.
Oh, really?
Because COVID was so dramatic and it was so impactful that there were so many knee-jerk reactions. Whereas the business case that we were promoting pre-COVID was duty of care over staff. Yes, amazing. But did you know that the economic benefit is quite significant. And that was quite a good story and one that people were buying into. And then COVID happened and all of the questions and ultimately all of the business cases started to pivot towards COVID. And whilst that was okay for a year or so, it then died off. We went back to the business case of the economic benefit, but it didn't feel like it's carried quite as much weight as it did pre-COVID.
Okay. Yeah. I agree. I think the data which we've seen and the technology which we do has definitely proved with air quality that we can utilize it to really make a huge impact on energy savings. So it is definitely the way. And I think you're right. Probably did get diluted by COVID into it.
Yeah, and I think energy is probably the big one now because it's got so much importance and weight in the conversation around ESG, around facilities management, that it's almost like we feel as though we need to hitch the indoor air quality bandwagon onto energy. Yes. It's like, well, that one's got momentum. So how can we also keep up with the momentum that's coming? And we, as an industry, shouldn't just be focused on energy, because the more energy efficient you make buildings, the more airtight they're probably going to be, the more that we're sealed in with air, which could be compromising our health. So we should be doing the two in tandem anyway.
Yeah, it feels like it fits into the sustainability ESG conversation, and it doesn't feel like it's getting picked up in the same way that energy, water, social is really captured. I think it needs to be a higher priority there, doesn't it?
Definitely. And on the energy front, I understand how easily quantifiable it is. And you can talk about energy savings, which equal cost savings. Whereas we're approaching it from a different angle, which is if your air quality is better, your people will be more productive. There'll be theoretically less absenteeism. But it's not the saving, it's the gaining. And that doesn't seem to loosen the purse strings in the same way.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's ROI based. Everything with commercial real estate is very focused on what's the ROI, how quickly is that going to be? And then the investment might look into it. And I think that slows the whole conversation down, doesn't it?
It does. And as much as you try, and again, if we're trying to capitalize on certain messaging, trying to push indoor air quality into the social conversation, again, it seems to lack oomph, because social, I don't know, it feels as though that's more to do with the community surrounding the building, as opposed to the people in the space or the health of the people in the space, which is so bizarre. And I was at UK Reef, as you were, a little while ago, and I was on a panel and we were talking about housing. So I know this is slightly deviating from commercial real estate. We were talking about housing and places for people. Greg Reed was on the panel and he was saying, places for people. We build places for people. And I just thought, what were we doing before? Whereas you look at like athletic facilities and everything's so finely tuned. And you look at casinos and they're pumping oxygen in to keep people alert and awake. And then we look at commercial real estate where there are a huge number of people with varying degrees of salary. And we just don't treat those places as high performance spaces. But we probably should think about doing that.
Yeah, and also the data which is used to make decisions on how a space is performing or being in the right set points, etc., is all based off very old data out of the 60s, based on certain people, me, basically.
But in a suit of like a very specific type of material. All these calculations are specifically about temperature we're talking. But you're right, completely outdated, completely archaic in terms of how we approach this. And the changing climate as well, it's getting hotter.
Yeah, and not reflecting the modern workforce.
Correct, yeah.
So obviously, I think we'll talk about how you're transitioning and what you're doing next, but also I think it'd be really good to understand from your point of view in the commercial real estate world, some of the challenges and parts which you've seen in terms of trying to implement change and where that resistance lies. I know you talked about very much about ROI and whatnot, but I think, how do we get past that? How have you broken down those barriers as well?
So, I would say the challenge for me was even using the leverage of building regulations that was only for new buildings or heavy refurbishments, most of the people we were speaking to on client side had a lot of existing stock that didn't apply to. So we were saying, well, you should probably future-proof your buildings. Like, they're ultimately going to undergo a heavy refurbishment at some stage in the next couple of decades. Why don't you just start the monitoring now? It's best practice. No, it's not mandatory yet, but get ahead of the curve. And there were some people who were really responsive to that or to the messaging that was about the economic benefit or the duty of care over staff. And that was where it was really important for us, was to have that champion in an organization who would lead the charge and kind of create a strategy across different funds, across a portfolio of assets, because we didn't just want to be applied to one, because ultimately it was a benchmark. So you could apply it over a whole bunch of assets and look at the best performing, the worst performing. So I think from my perspective, that was a challenge. I see on client side, and a lot of people I'm speaking for here, but they might have been a champion of what we were doing and trying to embed it in the organizational strategy for ESG, CSR, all the other acronyms that there are out there. But they faced resistance as well internally. And I think some of that was due to just not quite the right incentive mechanism. So if you're speaking to someone who's leading a strategy, it's a very different conversation to one that you'd be having with an asset manager, for example, who, again, coming back to cost savings, cost cutting, is more incentivized to do that than they are to spend money on new initiatives and push things forward. A lot of them want to, but that's not what the incentive mechanisms are promoting at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think, can we talk about your current role in terms of your consultancy stuff which you're doing at the moment?
Yes. Yeah.
So that's a bit of a flip, isn't it? So you're working with the Bellrock Group now?
Correct.
And so you're doing a consultancy role there on air quality.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of a flip, not a complete flip to client side, but almost onto a client side position and consultancy role there. And how are you finding that?
So working at Bellrock is interesting because we're working with the people that manage the buildings now. Not that we were working against them before, but we were mandated, for example, by the landlord. And then Bellrock were the ones in the building at the coalface having to manage the assets, manage the occupiers in the building. So it felt as though we were being pushed onto them when I was at AirRated, whereas now I'm in with them. I'm at the coalface with them almost. And it's been so much better because I can get direct feedback to say, when I was at AirRated, we were producing these reports for you about the performance of indoor air quality in your space. Was that meaningful? Did that add value in any way? Because it was adding value to the landlord because that was our client, but you were the ones operating the space, managing the space. Was it delivering value to you? And they would give us, they have been giving me very good feedback on what was good and what was bad about it.
I think I've seen something you've mentioned before, which is we get the data, but what do we do now? And that's kind of your role, isn't it? Is how to explain that data, what it means, and then the next steps. And I think that's something which is quite often missed, especially in the IoT world, where we're putting in sensors, people putting in sensors, they're thinking they're doing the right thing, but they're just sat there in a silo and just doing their own thing. They're reporting on their quality, but it's not doing, there's no action which comes out of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of where you're coming from, where what's really important, isn't it?
Yeah. And coming back to the point before about landlord versus facilities manager, landlords a lot of the time will be striving for innovation. So they'll be implementing this tech into buildings. So all of a sudden, as a facilities manager, you see these boxes being set up in a couple of your buildings, and nothing's been communicated to you, but perhaps not quite enough has been communicated to you in terms of what these boxes are monitoring and whether you're going to need to do something as a result. And then if you're required to, what does that look like?
Yeah. And do you also get the fear factor as well from the site teams that this is getting put in? I run this building, this is my building. There's quite a lot of feeling about that. And people are very emotive about the buildings which they run, they see themselves as part of that building. And having someone come in and tell them potentially they feel like they're getting told they're not doing a good job, or it's being reported that it's not working how it should be, is a slight on them. It's a negative on them, and they struggle with that. And that's probably where you're talking about that friction.
Yeah, definitely. And it's because it should be framed that this tech is being introduced to support you doing your role, so it can flag things perhaps before you get complaints about it from occupiers, which is only a good thing. But you're right, if it's thrown in and it's almost, I don't know, not communicated that it's not an expose on how you manage the property, then it can be. I would be daunted. If someone put something into my house that started monitoring it, I'd be like, oh my God, I'm going to change all my behaviors and all my ways of operating. So yeah, there is definitely an emotive part to it, which is where, again, it's not necessarily like the energy conversation, because that's quite black and white, quite matter of fact. A lot of the time it's up to the occupiers in the property what the energy consumption is. But yeah, when it comes to the indoor air quality, I mean, to be honest, it's factors that influence it are the design of the property, the maintenance of the property, and the behavioral elements. So there are those three aspects, but I think people will ultimately start pointing fingers if they were going to a facilities manager. That's not quite right, but because you don't know what you don't know, it's like, well, that's the person who's looking after the space. That must be the person who can make it better. And sometimes there are just so many limitations in these properties, particularly in existing stock, that just mean there's only so much you can do from an operational perspective before investments are required to upgrade the asset.
Yeah, exactly. So obviously aerated, now with Bell Rock consultancy, also you do the Clean Air London as well. Your board member
London
on that. Looking back at aerated, I think, and how you're entering the market and commercial real estate, is there anything which you're now looking back on it, now you've got these other experiences, would do it differently?
When I was with aerated, I did consider that an air score, so an indoor air quality performance score, similar to an EPC, energy performance certificate, but for indoor air, might take the same route as BREEAM, for example. So BREEAM, the sustainability credential, in that it could get to a point where it was mandatory for public buildings and then voluntary for private sector. But I do get the distinct impression that if you don't have a BREEAM rating, people are thinking, what's wrong with your building? And then it's just a case of what classification you get as opposed to whether you've got it or not. But that whole process for BREEAM took decades. Like BREEAM started in the 1990s, and then it got to that stage in the 2000s. So it was a long old time. And I think the kind of quick way that we were being adopted was by basically showing that we could strengthen GRESB scores. So GRESB being the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, for anyone that loves another acronym. And we saw that, again, because that was quantifiable, because it enhanced or maintained fund and asset value, that was a good way to get in. So yeah, I think looking back, I wouldn't necessarily have done anything different. The campaigning side and the policy influence that I do on the side, like the non-commercial side of my work, is important for awareness, because awareness was the big thing that was lacking at aerated. We never really had enough money to do massive campaigns. But I think the awareness was an issue in terms of people just not necessarily being educated enough to understand the benefits or the negatives that could come with indoor air quality, because I don't necessarily think there's anything I would have done differently if we had had the funding, a large enough pool of funding, because we had some decent money, but not quite enough. I think that big educational push would have been the thing to build momentum a bit more rapidly.
Did you find there's a big fear factor as well with landlords, owners about collecting air quality data and the sharing of that with their occupiers as well?
Yes, because air is invisible. So as a landlord, you've got next to no idea how your space is going to perform. There were a couple of incidences where we would have this conversation with landlords and they would be deeply fearful but kind of wanted to do it. So we would send out a questionnaire beforehand and say, what type of ventilation system do you use? Is it mechanical? Is it natural ventilation, or is it hybrid? Where is the property? It's like, give us the postcode, or if it's abroad, give us the location so we can look at the external air quality in the area, because that's ultimately going to influence internal. And we would ask about whether they had heating and cooling systems. So a set of probably 5 to 7 questions where we could say, with a pretty good degree of certainty with all the data and certificates we had done beforehand, how this building might perform. So, and we would only say it to the degree of 95% of buildings that have this makeup would at least pass. So we had a tiered system, certified for pass, silver, gold, platinum. So we would never want to guarantee a gold and then it comes back as silver, but we would say 95% of properties with the similar makeup in a very similar location do at least pass. And then if for whatever reason they didn't pass or they got a very low score, then it's probably more to do with the maintenance of the property, or in a lot of cases, the behavioral element. And by behavior, it's a lot of things, but it does encompass how occupiers adopt the space themselves. So the type of fit out that they introduce if they're in charge of their own Cat B fit out, but also the density to which they occupy the space. Mm-hmm. That's a really big one as well. So a couple of those factors that would influence the score, but ultimately if the like the physical makeup of the building and the geographical location are conducive to something that would pass, then most of the time it'd be fine.
From the experience which I had with AirRated and also on a lot of the properties which we collect air quality data, actually isn't as bad as our clients were first expecting or worried about as well, which also was quite something which we've been able to say is actually it's not probably as bad as you think it's going to be.
Yeah.
Is that have I lucked out with the buildings and the clients which we've been dealing with, or is that something which you've seen across the board in terms of the certification scheme that actually, generally speaking, most are in an okay position?
I think with commercial real estate, things are designed well. So if you've got a property in the middle of London, it's probably the case that the design team, whenever it was, whether it was
over-engineered it,
potentially, and like maybe they stripped some bits away, but commercial real estate is such a nice, controlled, unexceptional, if that's the right word, environment. You're not cooking in these buildings. You just sit down and you work all day. So there's only so much that you can screw up, to be honest with you. There's a lot that's influenced by the interior design. But again, that's only impactful for the first
3 months.
6-12 months. Yeah, like 6-12 months at worst. Yeah. But the first 3 months for sure.
Yeah, we saw on our data, we've seen a big drop off in, say, like TVOCs, if you want to explain that to people who are watching, because I can't. But for like TVOCs, we saw, generally speaking, after fit out, quite a jump down after, say, 3 months, and then a continual jump down until 6 to 12 months.
Yeah. Yeah, so TVOCs are total volatile organic compounds. Another acronym. Basically, things you can smell. So it encompasses such a wide range of things. And some of those things are gases that come off new furniture. They come from freshly painted walls, carpets. So new car smell is quite a good kind of comparison to draw. And you're right, there is the rate of off-gassing is much higher when things are newer. So you see probably quite high concentrations of TVOCs. And as you say, the more that off-gassing rate lessens over time, then you see that steady drop-off. And there are best practices that mean that concentration doesn't need to be quite as high as it is in the first couple of months. But again, it's all best practices, doesn't necessarily need to be done.
I'm seeing fit outs and the materiality chosen now, especially paints, etc., everyone seems to be a bit more aware of that than it used to be. And I think we're starting to see the initial high TVOCs slightly lower than they used to be as well because of that.
Yeah. And I think that's probably driven by education. But also, if you're painting your own home, you don't want to have that really smelly paint. So you might be more aware to look for a label that says low VOC. I do realise, again, I'm an exception to the rule, so I would actively be looking for those symbols. But they're quite well known in paints and glues. And a lot of companies themselves strive to have lower VOCs. So I think that is a big education piece that's been around for a while. When it comes to the design of a space, and what I mean by that is more where you're putting up wall partitions, that's perhaps slightly less understood because sometimes it's driven by aesthetic or utilization of the workplace. So if you know that you've got lots of people who take calls, you might put those phone booths in. You've probably seen them from time to time.
Yep.
They never have any ventilation going into them.
No.
Not the ones I've seen anyway, because they're either boxes that are standalone or they're kind of shunted towards the side of the the floor and they're all divided up. And when you're in there, it just feels a bit suffocating over time. And meeting rooms even, or people's personal offices, if you've got a nice building with glass windows and you've got quite a nice view, you might say, well, I want my office or I want that meeting room to have the nice view. You're not thinking about ventilation. But that's where workplace designers kind of need to take charge a little bit more and say to clients, okay, we understand what you want in terms of the aesthetic, because that's your driver, or workplace utilization, but we just need to take into account what's above the ceiling and the limitations that we're going to have with delivering on that.
And I think on that, it'd be great to understand kind of maybe one tech change which you believe in, but also I just want to put in something whilst we're on air quality about one of the tech things which I see coming in a little bit at the moment, which is scenting of office spaces and how you feel that sits with air quality in office spaces, because we're seeing more and more of it.
We are seeing more and more of it. And this is, again, the driver behind the decision for workplace scent is driven by experiential drivers. So it's like, how does someone experience the space when they come in? It looks nice. It feels nice and cool. It smells nice. And I understand that. I understand the reason behind it being introduced. I do not agree with the degree to which these spaces are pumped with scent. So they're usually quite potent, and the scent have these VOCs in them, which to either people who are sensitive to these things, or over time, just someone who isn't sensitive will become more aware of it, because it's usually a bit of an irritant to your nose. It can give you a headache over time. And I think it's just good to be aware of what's in the scent, because there are more that are low VOC. They don't smell quite as punchy, or they're more organic in their makeup. Mm-hmm. I worked on a project where someone at the end of it said, now I understand clean air doesn't have a smell. And I really wish that message could be put on every single billboard around London. Clean air doesn't have a smell. If we're going to have a smell, I think we should be conscious of what we're putting into the air, because it can have pretty detrimental consequences. And that's not what anyone's trying to do. But yeah, ultimately, clean air doesn't have a smell, guys. That's the take-home message.
No, that's great. So that's obviously one which you don't believe in. So what's something which you do believe in? Goes without saying, I believe in indoor air quality monitoring, but I believe in indoor air quality monitoring alongside workplace utilization monitoring. The reason I say that is because sometimes if a sensor is monitoring carbon dioxide, CO2, a lot of organizations will use CO2 concentration as a proxy for occupant density, which is okay,
But ultimately, that's not helping you understand the ventilation aspect. In an ideal world, you would understand exactly the number of people that are in the space and the CO2 concentration, because then you can really start to deliver these insights to say, okay, on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, which is when most people are in offices now, the CO2 gets really high around 2 p.m. And if it happens at certain times of day, like ideally you would either have demand controlled ventilation capabilities, or is there a way that you can manage the space and where people congregate in these spaces a bit better to distribute that build-up a bit more? So I was actually monitoring a space recently where there was one part of a floor plate that had higher CO2 than anywhere else. So on the days, Monday or Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday rather, on those days it was red as opposed to greens/ambers on a RAG system. So red being a hot spot, green and amber being decent. It was the only place consistently that was reaching red. And it's because it wasn't really ventilated in the same way. It was a bit of a dead space on the floor plate. But also it was a place where people spend a lot of time. I think it was something like the finance department. So people who like are very rarely in meeting rooms and are sitting there all day. So one, they're sitting in a dead space for ventilation. And two, they're at the desk the majority of the time. And again, a lot of them come into the office. So
and tend to be tucked away.
And they're tucked away, yeah. So there's very little air circulation. It wasn't very well ventilated at all. And those people are sitting there all day. So knowing those things, it would be better to switch that bank of desks to say no one should really be sitting in the stagnant air place. But if, for example...
Hotspotting.
Yeah. Hot desking. So like if you've got salespeople who are out on the road quite a lot and they're popping into the office for an hour here and there, ideally they would sit there because they're not going to be there for extended periods of time. They're not going to have their cognitive performance impacted when they're doing their work.
So we've obviously talked a lot about air quality.
Oh, yeah.
A lot, unsurprisingly. But it's great, I think, and it goes back to this entrepreneurial part for you, I think is really cool because it's obviously something you're extremely passionate about, and being able to do and create businesses from something which you're so passionate about is really exciting, and it's really cool to be in a space and be involved in that, I think. On your entrepreneurial journey, and obviously you're onto a slightly new part of it now, isn't it? How have you found that, and what have been the big challenges for you personally on that?
The quite cool thing, I guess, is that whenever I'm pitching a new variation of an air quality solution, because to be honest, they're all quite similar, it's always really refreshing that you see the light bulb go off. And like people's literally in their eyes, they start sparking, because typically the way we approach it is to say, well, you breathe 11,000 liters of air a day. It's a lot of air. You eat 3 to 4 times, you drink 8 glasses of water, but we're all super conscious about what we ingest food and drink wise, but not about what we breathe in the same way. And it's super impactful. And again, we're quite well educated on nutrition and cleanliness of beverages, but not so well educated on air. And it's pretty fundamental. And this is air indoors, yes, but also outdoors and in those transient spaces. So on the London Underground as an example, or on a bus. And I think that's the important part that I'm now tapping into, is like personal exposure. So at AirRated, we dealt with business to business activities. So it was me pitching about this concept of indoor air quality certification to organizations to say, this is what it means for people and productivity. This is what it means for fund value and asset value. And that was a good conversation. It was interesting, but I think there's a lot more to be done on an individual level, and people connecting more with indoor air quality, or air quality as a whole, but their personal exposure to it. And when we've had conversations, either pitching for investment or pitching to user groups, it's always a really nice conversation to have because it fits into this health equation. I mean, we talk about step count, we talk about screen time, we talk about calorie intake, heart rate. We track so many things that promote health, well-being, longevity. The one thing that's missing from that health equation is air. And that feels odd. It doesn't actually matter whether I'm pitching to businesses or to consumers. It's the same thing each time. This is not a topic that just sits by itself that people either care about or they don't. It impacts sleep quality. It impacts, we've talked about cognitive performance a lot, but that is like how your brain processes and understands data, and then ultimately impacts your level of productivity. So if we're able to say it impacts skin health, cognitive performance, sleep quality, athletic performance, you start to be able to integrate it into almost everyone's lifestyle in a really nice, unobtrusive way that actually is relevant to things that they care about. A lot of people might buy an air purifier but have done no monitoring. So they are fixing a problem they don't know that they have or not. Air purifiers generally are good, but you might need a slightly different makeup of filter inside this air purifier depending on your location. And you're only going to know that if you start with monitoring.
Yeah, I think I saw a great video as well where a really popular air filter was being put into lots of people's homes. They're putting them themselves, and they find out 6 months down the line that they hadn't taken the plastic wrapping off the filter on the inside.
That's so common.
Yeah.
It's so common. And again, like monitoring would help you understand that maybe something wasn't quite right about the air purifier that you had bought, because things wouldn't be getting better.
Yeah.
And they should be. So yeah, it's all about how you make the invisible visible, whether you're talking to businesses about commercial real estate or people about their dynamic environments, and then not leaning too heavily into the numbers, because sometimes that can be a bit confusing, but surfacing some interesting contextual insights and then delivering the actions through.
And so in that, you also mentioned something which I find really interesting, because it's a world which I don't know, which is getting venture capital.
Oh, yeah.
Can you just very quickly just explain what that process is like and how much fun you've had in that so last?
How much fun? Yeah, it's
fun, not
been
the
grand. Psychologically scarred from the process. No, it's a lengthy process, and a lot of it, well, I'm very grateful for the network that I have, because most of the conversations with venture capital or with angel investors have been a result of someone introducing me. And it's a lot easier to have a conversation with an angel investor or venture capital if you're warmed up before you meet them. And I mean, each of these, less so angel investors, but venture capital do have investment theses. So if you read up on that and then kind of tweak your pitch to suit their thesis, then you stand a much better chance. And most venture capital are very understanding of early stage businesses. So a lot of them don't invest in pre-seed. They want to see quite a bit of traction, and then they'll invest seed, Series A, or further along. So the challenge with new venture was that we were pre-seed. Yeah. So we had a hypothesis, and it's like, this is probably going to be something that will be incredibly popular if it's executed well. But we've got hardware and associated software. And that does mean that we need capital to build the thing and then to test whether it's got any traction, which is a very difficult thing to proposition to venture capital, who are mostly terrified of hardware because of the cost of it. So we had to, again, make sure that we were filtering the conversations that we were having based on those who had recently invested in hardware businesses. Not that we're positioning ourselves as a hardware business. Ultimately, it's the software, but we do need that hardware vehicle to collect the data in the first place. So yeah, I think with the journey, it's long. There's a lot of rejection. But I've faced a lot of that in the past in the property world, where air quality is not flavor of the month in a lot of places. So it's just about chugging along. And it is such a numbers game. It's a numbers game and it's a relationship game. So yeah, the network I have is amazing. And sometimes it would be the case that for whatever reason, we weren't the right fit for a particular venture capital, but they're not afraid to introduce to others in their sort of peer group, which I was shocked by because I thought it was quite competitive between them. But actually, I think they want businesses to be successful. And if they don't feel like they're the right ones, then they're quite happy to open up their own networks.
That's nice.
Yeah, it's lovely.
Apart from all the rejection.
Apart from all the rejection.
So going back to commercial real estate quickly, well, knowing what you know now about commercial real estate, would you say commercial real estate needs to evolve or does it need a revolution?
That's a really good question. It probably needs a bit of a revolution, to be honest. And this is not necessarily because of the quality of the buildings. I think it's the way in which we as a population are shifting our behaviours more than anything. There are a lot of commercial real estate blocks which are empty and they're being converted into residential dwellings. So I think it's how we make sure that, again, it comes back to this designing places for people, yes, but designing them for the new ways in which people are working. And we all know that the home is now an extension of the workplace. So I guess it's almost trying to encompass that into the workplace picture. But yeah, I think it's difficult because it's such a beast and there's been such a huge amount of change in the last 5 or 10 years. Definitely as a result of COVID, a phrase that I hate to use, but so much changed in 2020, 2021, the impact of which is still being felt. But also it's the changing climate, it's the level of future-proofing that buildings need. I think there's a huge amount of investment that needs to go into existing properties. New buildings need to be built with 50 years in mind, 50 years, 100 years in mind, not the next 10.
Right. Thank you very much, Frankie. Thank you for joining me on our first ever podcast.
Thanks for having me on your first ever podcast.
Really appreciate you joining me on this, and your thoughts are really honest and really practical insights into kind of how we're approaching commercial real estate and in particular air quality around that, and how we should implement change in commercial real estate as well. Wish you the best of luck with ERA.
Thank
is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, it is.
Cool. Got that right. So, which is really exciting. I can't wait to see how that journey progresses over the next couple of years.
And clean air has no smell.
Exactly. And on that note, until next time, thank you very much.
Thank you.